and, as there is no accounting for tastes, even a taste so strange as this may be recorded without being looked upon as a wilful and malicious invention, the truth is that neither Mrs Wackles nor her eldest daughter had at any time greatly favoured the pretensions of Mr Swiveller, being accustomed to make slight mention of him as a gay young man, and to sigh and shake their heads ominously whenever his name was mentioned. Mr Swiveller's conduct in respect to Miss Sophy having been of that vague and dilatory kind which is usually looked upon as betokening no fixed matrimonial intentions, the young lady herself began in course of time to deem it highly desirable that it should be brought to an issue one way or other. Hence she had at last consented to play off against Richard Swiveller a stricken market gardener, known to be ready with his offer on the smallest encouragement; and hence, as this occasion had been specially assigned for the purpose, that great anxiety on her part for Richard Swiveller's presence which had occasioned her to leave the note he has been seen to receive.
"If he has any expectations at all, or any means of keeping a wife well," said Mrs Wackles to her eldest daughter, "he'll say 'em to us now or never." If he really cares about me, thought Miss Sophy, he must tell me so to-night. But all these sayings and doings and thinkings being unknown to Mr Swiveller, affected him not in the least. He was debating in his mind how he could best turn jealous, and wishing that Sophy were for that occasion only far less pretty than she was, or that she were her own sister, which would have served his turn as well, when the company came, and among them the market gardener, whose name was Cheggs. But Mr Cheggs came not alone or unsupported, for he prudently brought along with him his sister, Miss Cheggs, who, making straight to Miss Sophy, and taking her by both hands, and kissing her on both cheeks, hoped in an audible whisper that they had not come too early. "Too early, no," replied Miss Sophy. "Oh, my dear," rejoined Miss Cheggs, in the same whisper as before, "I've been so tormented, so worried. It's a mercy we're not here at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Alick has been in such a state of impatience to come. You'd hardly believe that he was dressed before dinner time, and has been looking at the clock and teasing me ever since. It's all your fault, you naughty thing." Hereupon Miss Sophy blushed, and Mr Cheggs, who was bashful before ladies, blushed too, and Miss Sophy's mother and sisters, to prevent Mr Cheggs from blushing more, lavished civilities and attentions upon him, and left Richard Swiveller to take care of himself. Here was the very thing he wanted. Here was good cause, reason, and foundation for pretending to be angry. But having this cause, reason, and foundation which he had come expressly to seek, not expecting to find, Richard Swiveller was angry in sound earnest, and wondered what the devil Cheggs meant by his impudence. However, Mr Swiveller had Miss Sophy's hand for the first quadrille, country dances being low were utterly proscribed, and so gained an advantage over his rival, who sat despondingly in a corner and contemplated the glorious figure of the young lady as she moved through the mazy dance. Nor was this the only start Mr Swiveller had of the market gardener, for determining to show the family what quality of man they trifled with, and influenced perhaps by his late libations, he performed such feats of agility and such spins and twirls as filled the company with astonishment, and in particular caused a very long gentleman who was dancing with a very short scholar to stand quite transfixed by wonder and admiration. Even Mrs Wackles forgot for the moment to snub 3 small young ladies who were inclined to be happy, and could not repress a rising thought that to have such a dancer as that in the family would be a pride indeed. At this momentous crisis, Miss Cheggs proved herself a vigorous and useful ally, for not confining herself to expressing by scornful smiles a contempt for Mr Swiveller's accomplishments, she took every opportunity of whispering into Miss Sophy's ear expressions of condolence and sympathy on her being worried by such a ridiculous creature, declaring that she was frightened to death lest Alick should fall upon and beat him in the fullness of his wrath, and entreating Miss Sophy to observe how the eyes of the said Alick gleamed with love and fury, passions, it may be observed, which being too much for his eyes, rushed into his nose also, and suffused it with a crimson glow. "You must dance with Miss Cheggs,"
said Miss Sophy to Dick Swiveller, after she had herself danced twice with Mr Cheggs, and made great show of encouraging his advances.
She's a nice girl, and her brother's quite delightful.
Quite delightful, is he? Muttered Dick. Quite delighted too, I should say, from the manner in which he's looking this way. Here Miss Jane, previously instructed for the purpose, interposed her many curls, and whispered her sister to observe how jealous Mr Cheggs was.
Jealous?
Like his impudence, said Richard Swiveller.
His impudence, Mr Swiveller?
Said Miss Jane, tossing her head.
Take care he don't hear you, sir, or you may be sorry for it.
Oh, pray, Jane, said Miss Sophy.
Nonsense, replied her sister. Why shouldn't Mr Cheggs be jealous if he likes? I like that, certainly. Mr Cheggs has a good right to be jealous as anyone else has, and perhaps he may have a better right soon if he hasn't already. You know best about that, Sophy.
Though this was a concerted plot between Miss Sophy and her sister, originating in humane intentions, and having for its object the inducing Mr Swiveller to declare himself in time, it failed in its effect, for Miss Jane, being one of those young ladies who are prematurely shrill and shrewish, gave such undue importance to her part that Mr Swiveller retired in dudgeon, resigning his mistress to Mr Cheggs, and conveying a defiance into his looks which that gentleman indignantly returned. "Did you speak to me, sir?" said Mr Cheggs, following him into a corner. "Have the kindness to smile, sir, in order that we may not be suspected. Did you speak to me, sir?" Mr Swiveller looked with a supercilious smile at Mr Cheggs's toes, then raised his eyes from them to his ankles, and from that to his shin, from that to his knee, and so on very gradually, keeping up his right leg, until he reached his waistcoat, when he raised his eyes from button to button until he reached his chin, and travelling straight up the middle of his nose, came at last to his eyes, when he said abruptly, "No, sir, I didn't." "Ahem!" said Mr Cheggs, glancing over his shoulder. "Have the goodness to smile again, sir. Perhaps you wished to speak to me, sir?"
No, sir, I didn't do that either."
"Perhaps you may have nothing to say to me now, sir?" said Mr Cheggs fiercely. At these words Richard Swiveller withdrew his eyes from Mr Cheggs's face, and travelling down the middle of his nose, and down his waistcoat, and down his right leg, reached his toes again, and carefully surveyed him. This done, he crossed over, and coming up the other leg, and thence approaching by the waistcoat as before, said, when he had got to his eyes, "No, sir, I haven't." "Oh, indeed, sir," said Mr Cheggs. "I'm glad to hear it. You know where I'm to be found, I suppose, sir, in case you should have anything to say to me?" "I can easily inquire, sir, when I want to know. There's nothing more we need say, I believe, sir." "Nothing more, sir." With that, they closed the tremendous dialogue by frowning mutually. Mr Cheggs hastened to tender his hand to Miss Sophy, and Mr Swiveller sat himself down in a corner, in a very moody state. Hard by this corner, Mrs Wackles and Miss Wackles were seated, looking on at the dance; and unto Mrs and Miss Wackles, Miss Cheggs occasionally darted when her partner was occupied with a share of the figure, and made some remark or other which was gall and wormwood to Richard Swiveller's soul. Looking into the eyes of Mrs and Miss Wackles for encouragement, and sitting very upright and uncomfortable on a couple of hard stools, were two of the day scholars; and when Miss Wackles smiled, and Mrs Wackles smiled, the two little girls on the stools sought to curry favour by smiling likewise; in gracious acknowledgment of which attention the old lady frowned them down instantly, and said that if they dared to be guilty of such an impertinence again, they should be sent under convoy to their respective homes. This threat caused one of the young ladies, she being of a weak and trembling temperament, to shed tears, and for this offence they were both filed off immediately, with a dreadful promptitude that struck terror into the souls of all the pupils.
"I've got such news for you," said Miss Cheggs, approaching once more. Alick has been saying such things to Sophy. Upon my word, you know, it's quite